Hi, this is Misha, and this is part 3 in our ongoing series about the Russian Mosin-Nagant. Part 1 was on the original 1891 infantry rifle, also the Dragoon. Part 2, of course, had to be on the 9130, which was not quite a short rifle, a long short rifle, based also on the Dragoon, and the one produced definitely by and large in the most numbers. And so part 3, we're going to look at the Carbines, which is really an interesting story. On the table here, I have an original model 1938 M38 Carbine. And also a 1944 M44 model 1944 Carbine. Interestingly, these are both Mishaco and both made in 1944. I didn't plan it that way. These are just the ones I ended up with when these were cheap and I ordered them a long time ago. Okay, so the Russian Mosin Carbine. I alluded to the fact in World War I there really wasn't a carbine, at least not in the beginning. When the infantry rifle was adopted, and then its slightly shorter cousins, the Dragoon and Cossack. This was back in 1891. The Russian higher-ups, the bigwigs, the men in charge, did not want to adopt a carbine. They knew that other nations were doing it. Most famously, Britain had carbine versions of the Enfield. America had a carbine version of its Craig. Germany had various carbine versions of the 1888 commission rifle and so on and so forth. Italy definitely had carbine versions of its Carcanos. Japan, same with its Arisakas. But they said, nah, we don't need it. We don't need a carbine. Our cavalry are basically dragoons. They're going to get off their horses to fight. We wanted to give them a longer gun, so hence the Dragoon and the Cossacks. But the Russo-Japanese War happened. 1904 to 1905. Japan basically clobbered Russia. Now this was many reasons. Definitely their infantry rifle really didn't play much of any role in it. However, it showed the distinct lack of having a carbine in the Russian military, and they also saw that the Japanese were using effectively their Type 30 carbines in combat, and they saw that they weren't as inaccurate and useless as they were originally thinking. In 1907, the Tsar ordered that the military create a carbine version of the Mosin rifle. So work started. Took a couple of years. And what they came up with was actually very similar to this, at least dimensionally. The first Mosin carbine, at least produced in any numbers. I should say that there were some test batches and different patterns tried out, but they never were put into production. It had a 20-inch barrel, which was correspondingly nearly a foot shorter than the standard. The barrel was about 11.5 inches shorter, so yeah. The original infantry rifle was about 9.1 to 9.25 pounds. The new carbine was under 7.5 pounds, so we're saving about 2 pounds of weight, or nearly so. Otherwise, it had a lot of the same features of the updated 1891, which started to appear around the same time, and all the new features were basically there by 1910. Because its creation was ordered in 1907, this is known as the M1907 or 07 Carbine. Sometimes it's referred to as the 1910 because that's more in line with when it went into production. However, 1907 seems to be the actual official name of it. Anyway, it doesn't really matter what's in a name. They did have a carbine in limited production prior to World War I. And you would think with that kind of war they would kind of ramp up production, but they never really did. Between the time of its adoption in 1917, when it was taken out of production after the Revolution, they would only build about 344,000, so under 350,000. Not a very large number considering they already had nearly 4 million Mosin rifles by 1905. Very small number, really. And of course, many were lost to attrition during World War I. After the Revolution, the Dragoon pattern would replace the 91 infantry rifle pattern, and the 1907 would remain in standard service, standard issue, even though it was out of production throughout the 1920s. You know, for the few people they felt needed it, it would, the a couple of 100,000 they had left seemed to be enough. Well, the 9130 was adopted, and by 1936, the full 9130 pattern, including round receiver, was in production. Well, in 1938, they decided we do need a new pattern of Mosin carbine. The old ones, the 1907s, were wearing out. Spare parts were getting hard to find for them. And by the standards of the 30s, it was going to be too expensive to put them back into production because we have a lot of the original features on those. Hence, where this model 1938 comes from. They ordered these developed in that year, and basically this is a 1907 that received the same treatment as the 91 did to become the 9130. We still have a 20-inch barrel. The stock is correspondingly shortened, of course. We have an overall length that is correspondingly shorter. We're right at about 40 inches overall. Obviously, the 9130, based on the Dragoon, is shorter than the infantry, so instead of being nearly a foot shorter, we're, about 8 inches, 9 inches shorter than the standard. We're a little bit shorter though, and we're quite a bit lighter. This is a little bit heavier because of the new features, new sights, little beefier furniture, new handguards and everything. We're at about a little over 7.5 pounds, call it 7.6 to 7 3/4 pounds. But, considering the 9130 is about 8 3/4 pounds, we're still a good pound, maybe a pound and a quarter lighter. These are going to production at Mishaco in 1939. There wasn't a long R&D period because it's the same Mosin action. We just use a shorter barrel. We use the same style of rear sight, but it's graduated to a shorter range, and it's a shorter sight for this. Shorter barrel. The front sight is pretty much the same too. Now, if you note, there's really not much muzzle sticking out past the sight. That means this cannot accept a 9130 bayonet, but they didn't think it was needed. These were issued to the usual suspects who might need a personal defense type weapon: second line soldiers, artillery crews, signals officers, couriers, a few mechanized people. The Russian military didn't have a lot of mechanized units in the 30s, but they did some. People who needed a short, handy little gun, mostly for defense. That was the idea. But being Soviet Russia, they would put these into full-scale production. In total, they would make about 3 million. Now, they started to put these in production at Tula also in 1940. But the Germans invaded in 41 and Tula was relocated, so Tula production was pretty quickly curtailed for the 38. Mishaco, though, would continue manufacturing these throughout the 40s, at least the early 40s, and Tula would pick back up in 1944 and make another batch. So you'll find 40 and 44 dated Tulas, and you'll find Mishaco guns that are dated all the way from 39 to 44. Now, these are just general guidelines. Normally these have round receivers because that was the standard production at the time. However, there are plenty of carbines reported with hex receivers. These seem to be older receivers that were recycled. And you'll see some kind of odd dates pop up here and again. Again, in World War II, they weren't really observing the niceties. As I said, this one was made in 44, which is kind of neat because it's a later production, really towards the very end of 38 Carbine. It has a true 38 Carbine stock. It has the single bottom escutcheon type sling slots. It's actually why I removed the sling on this one so you could see it. This is a neat, handy little carbine. It's probably my favorite Mosin. It does kick the snot out of you though and have a giant fireball, because this is still firing the standard 7.62 by 54R rimmed cartridge. The receiver is completely the same as on a standard 9130. These would see extensive use in the Great Patriotic War, and actually proved themselves so handy that led to this version here. As I said, the Russians were always kind of reluctant to see the usefulness of a carbine. At first they didn't want to adopt one, then when they finally did, they didn't make a whole lot, and even when they adopted it and made it in the millions, they were really wanting to originally just issue it to second line and reserve and other people troops. But the M38 proved so useful in World War II, led to this gun here. The M44 is essentially the exact same gun, but with a few changes. The war showed that the SVT and the 9130 were pretty damn long and heavy. It also showed that the PPSH-41 submachine gun was really useful and effective, at least in close range. Likewise, the M38. So it showed Russia the utility of a short gun. So in 1943, they would do a test batch of M38s manufactured with a new folding bayonet housing designed by a Russian officer, Simeon. This is basically the spike bayonet from the 9130 on a hinged housing and put around the barrel. Now the reason they added this, they finally decided to adopt a carbine as standard issue to replace the 9130 in the Red Army. They thought if they took the M38 and gave it a bayonet, it would be good enough as a standard issue rifle. And to some extent they were perfectly right. They did that test batch in 1943. It worked out, so they decided to put it into full production in 1944. Izhevsk again would make the majority of these, but Tula would also make a batch in 1944, leading into 1945. There's some debate about that, but it doesn't matter. Tula would make a small number. Izhevsk would make them for a longer period of time, 1947 and 1948, in that time frame. So after World War II. This is essentially the exact same gun, with a couple of small changes. Sights are the same, receiver is the same. The stock is a little bit beefier. As you see, it has larger finger grooves compared to the 38. It also is inletted for the bayonet. It's just generally speaking a little bit heavier of a stock, more durable, because again they were expecting these to be standard issue, not to limited numbers of troops. They would make some of these stocks out of laminate wood, and you'll find some 38 stuck in laminate wood stocks, but if you look at them, they always have the cutout. As far as I know, and I very well could be wrong, the laminate stocks were always just for the M44, and just some M38s got dropped into them. We have this bayonet housing, as I said. It's permanent to the barrel. You can unscrew the actual spike, but the mount is permanent. And as I pointed out earlier, the barrel on the 38 does not stick out far enough to really mount a bayonet ring of any type. So what they did for the 44, they extended the barrel out to 20.5 inches. So we would have enough room to put a bayonet ring around it securely with enough meat left over at the edge, so we're not right on the muzzle. So this is just ever so slightly longer. Also, because of the heavier stock and the bayonet assembly, we're heavier. Somewhat ironically, we're just a little bit heavier than the 9130. This thing is just a smidge under 9 pounds. But that's with the bayonet, and we are still nearly 8 inches shorter. So we are quite a bit shorter. These seem to be made with a little looser tolerance. So the fit and finish seems to be a little sloppier on the M44s compared to the M38s. And the bores seem to have a little bit larger of a diameter. These are more prone to keyholing with modern production ammo, which is usually 308. The original Russian 7.62-54R was in .310, .311. And when they went to the M44, they seemed like they opened that up to about .312, maybe even .313. I'm not a a guy into ballistics a lot, guys, but I know that these have just a little bit looser bores, which can lead to some problems for reloaders if you're especially trying to use 308 projectiles. I honestly cannot remember how many Russia made of these. Apologies, it was several million. And that would bring, when these came to production end in 1948, the total of Mosins made in Russia to about 37 to 38 million between the originals and these. Now, of course, keep in mind, they were in production for 55 years. So that accounts for that. And they went through 2 major wars. The M44 was nominally the standard issue gun for the Red Army at the end of the Great Patriotic War, World War II. However, in practice, not that many were in service by the time Berlin was captured, just because they had only gone into production the year before, at least in large numbers. So in practice, it was still a lot of 9130s, some old SVTs, PPSHs, PPSs, so on and so forth. And then after the war, new guns start to come online, such as the SKS-45, which was originally adopted in 1945, the AK-47, whose final pattern was developed in 1947. However, the SKS and the AK both went into production in 1949. The SKS started to be made in huge numbers in Russia right away. The AK was still made in small numbers in the beginning for the first few years because of manufacturing difficulties. So that gave the M44 a little breathing room in Russia. So this was most commonly standard issue in the late 40s and very early 50s. However, even after it was out of production in Russia and was being pulled out of frontline service for the SKS and AK, for one, it was switched over to second line to militia use in Russia, sure. Also, Russia was getting into the whole communist domination of Eastern Europe and trying to get into Asia game. And so they exported the M44 design to Allied nations in the Warsaw Pact. And they would actually build these in quite large numbers over outside of Russia, unlike the 9130, which they really didn't need to because Russia had so many. In Poland, this would go into production around 1950 as the WZ-44. The Polish guns are known for extremely high fit and finish. They were made at the Luxnik, the Radom factory, Factory 11. They would make them for a couple of years, not all that long. In Hungary, they would go in production at FEG, adopted as the 48M, and they would produce them to about 1953, give or take. Also quite good quality. Cougar in Romania would start producing these from about 53 to 55. They're of good quality. They have nice pretty bluing if nothing else. China would adopt it as the Type 53 and actually make quite a large number, and these would probably see more combat than any of the other post-war created guns, Vietnam, Korea, and so on. A few other nations would take older guns and turn them into M44s or M38s. For example, Czechoslovakia would take 9130s and cut them down to a 20-inch barrel, reworking them to what collectors refer to today as the 9138. Likewise, there is the 9159, which is a really interesting gun. It looks pretty much identical to this, but it's from a cut-down 9130, so the rear sight was originally the long rifle rear sight, and it was ground down to only work as a carbine rear sight. So the 9159 will have the long sight, but only adjustable for the shorter carbine range. It'll be an older gun, so it could be a Hex receiver, having an older date on it. For a long time, these were thought to have come out of Bulgaria. Some people say Russia. Nothing truly definitive, 100% definitive has ever really been established on the 9159s. They're very nice guns though, even though they are cut down guns, so you might find a gun that looks great on the outside, but the bore is a little But this seems to be one of the last gasps of Mosin carbines, even if they were converted versus brand new manufacture. And there's plenty of other variations. Trust me, this is not an exhaustive list. But just to give you an idea, this was exported more, and it really would kind of herald what would come soon with SKS production outside of Russia, and then of course Kalashnikov production outside of Russia. And these are the final really Mosin patterns. Well, that's about it. I guess I could talk about the surplus nature just a wee bit here. These started to come in from Russia along with the rifles. I saw the 38s first around 2001, 2002. Before the Russian M44s came in, there were quite a few of the Hungarian, Romanian, and Polish guns, but everyone wanted Russian at the time. And then the Russians started to come in around 03, and then the other guns started to dry up. So it's kind of ironic that today the Russians are more common. Of course, they made so many. The Chinese Type 53s used to be quite rare, but now in more recent times there have been official import batches of them. Usually they're not in fantastic condition, but they are authentic Type 53s. When these came in, they were priced about like all the other Mosins. I paid $100 for this one in a brick and mortar store around 2001, 2002. I liked it for the date and the fact that it had the correct stock. This one I kind of ended up with accidentally. The friend of mine that I would eventually help at his gun shop, I called him to check on the price of an M44 around 04 I think it was, maybe early 05. And when I called him back about a week later to see what the price was, he just said, "Oh, your rifle's here." And I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, I just ordered it." Turns out it was like $49.95 that week. It was on sale. He said, if I wanted it for $70, I could have it. If not, he'd put it on the rack. For $70, why not? And I'm happy I did. I mean, it's a neat pattern. I still like the M38 more, just for being lighter and a little handier, and honestly a little more unique. But they're both interesting guns, and a lot of history in both. Well, if you liked the video, we appreciate it if you could click like. Also, feel free to share your own Mosin carbine stories in the comments. If you have not already subscribed and could do so, we'd also appreciate that. And please check out our other Mosin and other bolt action videos if this interests you. And check in again next time for hopefully more interesting videos. This is Misha, and we'll catch you then.